You have got to be kidding me, the man shouted angrily as he stepped out of his luxury SUV. In the middle of a storm, the wealthy CEO stared at his flat tire, thinking about the $1 million contract he needed to sign that morning. Helpless and frustrated, he had no idea what to do, until suddenly, out of nowhere, two young black boys appeared and offered to help. What he didn't know was that this chance encounter wouldn't just save him once, it would change his life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where are you watching from. We love to hear your thought. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the windshield in a steady rhythm that made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead, and David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, muttering a curse under his breath as the wipers struggled to keep pace. The narrow country road was slick with water, puddles forming in the low dips and spilling across the asphalt, and the storm had darkened the sky so completely it might as well have been evening instead of morning. He glanced at the glowing numbers on the dashboard clock and felt his stomach tighten. The meeting was less than an hour away, a deal worth millions riding on his presence, yet here he was crawling through the countryside, far from the glass towers and polished offices where he belonged. He pressed the accelerator just a little harder, trying to coax more speed from the SUV, but the road answered with a sudden shudder, and then a sickening thump-thump-thump that jolted through the vehicle like a heartbeat gone wrong. You have got to be kidding me, David growled, slamming his palm against the steering wheel, the sound sharp in the muffled cocoon of rain. He eased the SUV onto the shoulder, mud splattering as the tires sank slightly into the soggy ground and cut the engine. For a moment he just sat there, listening to the hiss of the rain on the hood, feeling the pulse of frustration throb in his temples, before finally forcing himself out into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, soaking through his suit jacket almost instantly, plastering his shirt to his back, and he grimaced as the wind shoved at him, carrying with it the earthy scent of wet fields and the faint metallic tang of water on asphalt. He crouched by the rear tire, his polished shoes sinking into the mud, and saw the rubber shredded flaps of black torn and curling away from the rim. He pulled out his phone, wiping at the screen with damp fingers, but the screen showed only a mocking no service in the corner, and he cursed again, louder this time, shoving the useless device back into his pocket. He had never changed a tire in his life. Why would he? There had always been someone else for that, driver's assistance, service calls made with a tap of his phone. But now, out here alone, with the storm hammering down and the empty road stretching silent in both directions, there was no one. Just him, his ruined tire, and the creeping realization that he might miss the deal after all. He stood, water dripping from his hair into his eyes, scanning the horizon for anything. Another car, a farmhouse, a sign of life, but there was nothing but the swaying silhouettes of trees whipped by the storm and the endless shimmer of rain. He was about to retreat into the SUV when a movement caught his eye, a blur against the gray curtain of water. He squinted, wiping rain from his brow, and slowly the shapes resolved, two figures trudging along the side of the road, their outlines small against the sweep of the storm. As they drew closer he saw they were boys, maybe 14 and 10, their clothes damp, sneakers splashing through puddles, but their steps steady, their heads bent into the wind with the stubborn determination of kids used to walking these roads no matter the weather. David straightened, a strange mix of relief and skepticism tightening in his chest as the older one lifted his head and called out over the rain, "Mister, you got a flat." His voice was clear, unshaken, despite the storm. David nodded, shouting back, "Yeah, looks that way," and the boy motioned for his younger brother to follow as they jogged the last few yards. The older boy crouched beside the SUV, examining the tire with quick, practiced eyes, while the younger stood nearby, his gaze curious but unafraid. "We can fix it," the older said matter-of-factly, glancing up at David with a calm assurance that felt out of place coming from a kid in worn jeans and a rain-soaked t-shirt. "Our uncle showed us how. Got a spare?" For a moment David hesitated, staring at them, rain dripping off his jaw, torn between disbelief and the gnawing awareness that he had no other choice. "You can really do it?" he asked, his voice edged with doubt. The boy just gave a small grin, rain running down his cheeks, and replied, "It's just a tire, mister, no big deal." "Where's the jack?" David swallowed, then nodded toward the back of the SUV. The older boy gestured to his brother, and together they moved quickly, lifting the hatch, pulling out the tools and the spare with a practiced ease that made David feel suddenly foolish, like the suit and watch on his wrist were costumes hiding a helplessness he had spent years ignoring. He stood there awkwardly, arms crossed against the rain, watching as they worked. The clank of the wrench, the thud of the jack, the scrape of metal against metal, all sounds he had never associated with his own life, now orchestrated by two boys half his size. The younger one wiped rain from his forehead, glanced up at David, and said with a small smile, "We do this all the time, mister, don't worry." David didn't answer, he just watched, the rain soaking into his bones, the storm raging around them, and for the first time that morning, the urgency of his meeting slipped from his mind, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, a flicker of unease, of wonder at the sight of two children fixing what he, with all his wealth and power, could not. By the time the last lug nut clicked tight, and the spare was secured in place, David found himself staring in disbelief at what had just unfolded in the middle of that rain-lashed road, two boys working with the confidence of men twice their age while he stood by useless, a spectator in a suit and shoes caked with mud. The older boy wiped his hands on his jeans, rain streaking down his forehead, and gave a small nod. "All done, mister, you're good to go." David reached instinctively into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, bills dampened by the storm, and held them out, his hand trembling slightly more from the absurdity of it all than the chill. "Take this," he said, raising his voice over the patter of rain, "for your trouble. I appreciate it." But both boys stepped back, almost in unison, their eyes steady and voices firm despite their soaked clothes. "No thanks, mister," the younger piped up, shaking his head with a shy grin. "We didn't do it for money." The older added quietly, "Just wanted to help." For a moment David stood frozen, the bills fluttering in the wind like something out of place, before he shoved them back into his wallet with an awkward motion, muttering something that didn't quite make sense even to his own ears. The boys waved once, casual, and started down the road again, their figures shrinking into the curtain of rain, until they were nothing but silhouettes swallowed by the storm. David climbed back into his SUV, the leather seat squelching faintly under his drenched clothes, and sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the fogging windshield. He should have felt relief, gratitude, maybe even satisfaction that he could still make his meeting, but instead there was a tightness in his chest, an unsettling sense that something had shifted ever so slightly out of place. He shoved it down, started the engine, and pulled back onto the slick road, the rumble of the tires cutting through the storm, as he focused on the thought of that contract waiting for his signature. When he finally arrived at the gleaming office tower in the city, dripping wet and late, he expected impatience, disappointment, the cutting remarks of men who didn't forgive tardiness. Instead the meeting rolled on, and despite the delay, despite his frazzled state, the deal closed with handshakes and forced smiles, millions inked onto paper like it was nothing more than a line in a ledger. Relief coursed through him, the kind of relief that always came when numbers fell neatly into place, but beneath it something else lingered, quieter, harder to ignore, the image of two boys in the rain turning wrenches with calloused hands. By evening, with the contract secured, and the weight lifted, David let himself be pulled into celebration. A restaurant first, fine wines flowing, then a private club, the bass of music rattling glasses as colleagues toasted his success. He laughed too loudly, clinked too many glasses, and drank past the point of reason, each swallow burning away the unease, dulling the echo of young voices saying, "We didn't do it for money." Hours slipped by until the night was thick, and the city lights blurred into halos of gold and red. At 10 o'clock, someone suggested a car to take him home, a driver, a ride-share, anything, but David waved them off with the stubborn pride of a man who had always trusted his own control more than anyone else's. "I'm fine," he insisted, voice rough but confident, "I can handle it." And though his vision swam a little, though the pavement outside glistened slick from the day's storm, he dropped into the driver's seat of his SUV, the smell of alcohol clinging to him like a second skin, and gripped the wheel with the fervor of a man determined to prove he needed no one. The highway gave way to smaller roads, then to the familiar dark stretch of countryside where the storm had first undone him that morning. The rain had eased to a drizzle, the night heavy and quiet but for the steady hum of the engine. His eyelids drooped, his head nodded once, twice, until finally, lulled by exhaustion and alcohol, David drifted. The SUV veered just slightly off course, and then with a sudden jolt, the vehicle struck a tree at the side of the road, the sound a muffled crunch against the night. Airbags deployed with a violent hiss, and the world went black for him in an instant. It might have ended there if not for two familiar figures on that same lonely stretch of road. The brothers, heading home late from their day of apprenticing at the repair shop, heard the sound and ran. Their small forms cut through the darkness, hearts pounding as they saw the crumpled SUV and the man slumped inside. "It's him," the younger whispered, eyes wide. "The man from this morning." The older didn't waste a second, tugging at the door, pulling against the bent metal until it gave way with a groan. Together they dragged David free, his body heavy, his breath shallow but steady, without hesitation, with the simple urgency of those who had learned to help before thinking of anything else. The two boys half carried, half dragged him down the road toward the modest home that waited in the shadows beyond the fields, their own clothes soaked again, their steps sure, their faces set with determination. And as the night swallowed the road behind them, the rain fell soft, almost gentle now, like the world itself was holding its breath. David woke to the faint smell of something warm and earthy drifting through the air, a smell that didn't belong to the sterile world of marble floors and polished steel he was used to, but to somewhere simpler, quieter, almost foreign. His head throbbed, bandaged tightly, his arm ached, and when he pushed himself upright the blanket that had been draped over him slipped to the floor, revealing a small room with peeling paint, uneven wooden floorboards, and a sagging dresser tucked against the wall. The light that filtered in through the thin curtains was pale, softened by the lingering clouds of the storm. He rose carefully, his legs heavy and unsteady beneath him, and made his way toward the faint sound of voices. In the narrow hall he passed hooks where coats hung, frayed and faded, small shoes lined neatly beneath them. The house itself seemed worn but cared for, a place that had survived years of hard use without losing its sense of being lived in. When he reached the main room, the scene that met him made him pause. A woman stood at the stove, stirring a pot with slow, deliberate movements. Her name, he would soon learn, was Margaret Carter, her figure lean and tired yet strong in its quiet way, her dark hair tied back with a faded scarf, the lines around her eyes etched by both illness and resilience. The clothes she wore were plain, a long skirt and a blouse patched at the elbow, but there was a dignity in the way she moved, as though nothing about her life had stripped her of grace. At the small wooden table sat the two boys, Lucas the older one with sharp eyes and a steady calm, and Eli, the younger with a restless energy, his feet swinging above the floor as he tried to help his brothers set out mismatched plates. Their clothes were simple, jeans and t-shirts a size too big, washed thin by time, sneakers scuffed and damp from the night before, yet both wore expressions that seemed older than their years, shaped by responsibility far heavier than most children knew. David leaned against the doorframe, clearing his throat before he realized how strange it sounded to announce himself in someone else's home. All three turned to look at him. Lucas's face lit briefly with recognition, Eli's eyes widened, and Margaret set down the spoon, her expression shifting between caution and concern. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice carrying both relief and a firmness that suggested she was used to holding her family together by will alone. "You had an accident last night. My boys found you on the road and brought you here." She gestured toward his head. "You were bleeding. We did what we could." David raised a hand to the bandage, his mind still foggy. "My car, my phone," he began, his words clipped, urgent, his instinct to regain control immediate. Lucas shook his head gently, almost amused by the man's first thoughts. "Your car's still out there, mister. We'll take you to it later. You dropped your phone too, but maybe it's still near the tree." Eli chimed in, his voice higher but steady. "You're lucky, you know. Could have been worse." David blinked at them, then back at Margaret, who was now ladling porridge into bowls, the steam curling upward in thin white ribbons. "You need to rest," she said firmly, setting one of the bowls on the table. "Sit, eat something. You won't get far if you collapse on the road." For a moment David bristled, the reflex of a man unaccustomed to being told what to do in his own world of subordinates and staff. But his body betrayed him, his legs weak, his stomach hollow. He lowered himself into a chair, eyeing the table with a kind of discomfort. The meal was plain, porridge, a few slices of bread, a jar of preserves nearly empty. To him it looked meager, insufficient, something that would never have appeared on his polished dining table at home. Yet when Lucas pushed the bowl closer and Margaret gave him a quiet nod, he lifted the spoon reluctantly. The first mouthful surprised him. It was warm, rich with a simple flavor that settled into his chest, filling something deeper than hunger. He said nothing, but the spoon scraped against the bowl again, and then again, until the meal was gone. As he sat back, wiping at his mouth with the corner of a paper napkin, his eyes moved between them. The mother who carried herself with dignity despite her illness, the older boy with his calm steadiness, the younger with his restless spark, and for the first time he felt the weight of their kindness press against the hollowness inside him. He cleared his throat once more, softer this time. "I need to get to my car," he said. "My phone, my meetings, people are waiting." Margaret shook her head, though her smile was kind. "The world can wait one morning, mister. Your body can't, but if you insist, the boys will take you." Lucas and Eli exchanged a glance, then looked at him with that same steady clarity he had seen the night before. And as David met their gaze, the unease from the morning's memory returned, stronger now, a nagging reminder that no amount of money could explain why two children in worn shoes had saved his life twice in one day. When the bowl was nearly empty and the ache in his stomach had eased, David leaned back in the chair, the wooden legs creaking faintly under his weight, and glanced toward the doorway as if he might at any moment stand and leave, yet his body told him otherwise, every muscle reminding him of the crash, every breath still tight in his ribs. He wiped a hand across his face, feeling the stiffness of dried sweat, mingled with the faint sting of antiseptic where the bandages pressed against his skin, and he forced himself to ask the question gnawing at him. "Where exactly is my car?" His voice was sharper than he intended, but Lucas Boy only tilted his head, calm as before, and replied, "Down the road where you left it, mister, not too far. We can take you there when you're ready." David pressed, impatience creeping in. "And my phone, I need it. I've already missed calls this morning, I'm sure of it." Eli Boy, bright-eyed, answered quickly, "We saw it under the seat, mister. We can show you." He grinned as if retrieving a phone from a wreck was nothing at all. Margaret turned from the stove, her expression soft but firm, and said, "You shouldn't push yourself, not yet. One day's rest won't ruin your life, but rushing out might." David almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a stranger telling him to abandon schedules and obligations, but the look in her eyes was unyielding, not cruel, only steady, the look of someone who had carried heavier burdens than he could imagine. He nodded stiffly, unwilling to argue further, and rose from the chair with slow care. "Fine, show me the car, then I'll be out of your way." The boys exchanged a glance, not surprised by his insistence, and within minutes they were pulling on worn jackets, ready to guide him back. The road outside was damp from the night's storm, the fields on either side heavy with the scent of wet grass and earth, the air cool and still except for the squelch of their shoes in the mud. David walked a step behind them, his stride slower than usual, pride forcing him to keep pace, though his ribs ached with every breath. After a while he spoke, almost to distract himself from the pain. "So you boys learn all this fixing cars on your own?" Lucas one shrugged, glancing back with a faint smile. "Our uncle runs a shop a few towns over. He lets us help out sometimes, shows us things when he can. We walk there most days. It's about 5 kilometers. That's where we were headed yesterday when we saw you." Eli chimed in, "We like it. Feels good, you know, to make something work again, to fix something broken." His voice was innocent, but the words struck David harder than he expected, resonating in a place he didn't care to examine. They walked in silence for a stretch, Lucas Boy kicking at a pebble, Eli humming a tune under his breath, until David found himself asking, "And your mother, she doesn't work?" The words felt blunt, intrusive, but the boy answered simply, without shame. "She used to at the factory, but she got sick last year. She's better now, but not strong enough for long hours, so we do what we can." Eli added, "It's okay though, she takes care of us, we just help her back." David slowed his steps, staring at their small shoulders hunched against the breeze, and something twisted in his chest, a knot of unease that refused to loosen. He thought of his own house, gleaming floors, endless rooms, yet empty of warmth, and the sharp contrast made his mouth taste bitter. When they reached the bend in the road, the SUV came into view, its frame leaning slightly where the bumper had kissed the tree, glass glittering faintly on the ground like scattered ice. David felt a rush of relief at the sight of it, as if the familiar shape tethered him back to the life he understood. He pulled the door open with care, wincing at the creak of bent metal, and bent inside to retrieve his phone from where it had fallen beneath the seat. The screen flickered to life, a barrage of missed calls and unread messages filling it instantly, and the sight alone was enough to tighten his chest again with the weight of obligation. He dialed quickly, summoning his driver and assistant, his voice clipped as he gave instructions, already retreating into the shell of command where he felt strongest. While he waited, he turned back to the boys, forcing formality into his tone. "Thank you for last night, for this morning. You didn't have to, but you did." He reached into his wallet again, pressing bills into the air between them, but Lucas Boy only shook his head, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes steady. "We told you, mister, we don't need money for helping. It's just the right thing to do." Eli added with a smile, "You don't have to pay to be kind." The words hung in the cool morning air, simple yet cutting, and David found himself standing there with the bills still in his hand, more unsettled by their refusal than he wanted to admit. The rumble of an approaching car broke the silence, sleek and black against the pale sky, his driver stepping out with hurried concern. David gave a small nod, slipping the money back into his wallet, and looked at the boys one last time. "My name is David Whitmore," he said, pulling a card from the case in his jacket and holding it out. "If you ever need anything, ever you come find me." Lucas Boy hesitated, then accepted the card politely, though his expression suggested he didn't quite believe in promises from men in suits. Eli grinned and waved, already turning to head down the road toward the distant shop. As David settled into the back seat of his waiting car, leather soft beneath him, phone buzzing with insistent reminders of the world he belonged to, he caught a final glimpse of the two boys walking away, their heads bent close in conversation, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. And though he told himself to focus on the contracts waiting, the meetings to be salvaged, he couldn't stop hearing their words echoing in his mind. "You don't have to pay to be kind." The ride back to the city should have been a relief, a return to the familiar hum of control, yet as the car cut through the morning traffic, David sat stiff-backed in the rear seat, his phone buzzing relentlessly in his hand, and for the first time in years he ignored it. He stared out the tinted window instead, watching the blur of storefronts and commuters, but what he saw was not the city. It was the boys' faces, their damp hair plastered to their foreheads, their steady voices saying things no child should have to understand. He replayed it all in his head, the stubborn way they refused his money, the quiet strength in their eyes, and it unsettled him more than any missed call or late meeting ever could. By the time the car pulled through the gates of his estate, and into the long drive that curled up to his glass and stone mansion, his chest felt tight, a knot of unease pulling tighter with every step he took back toward the life that had once seemed unshakable. Inside, everything was as it always was, the marble floor gleaming, the silence absolute, the air too perfectly still. Clara was waiting near the stairs, a book in her hand, her expression shifting the moment she saw him. "You're hurt," she said quietly, eyes catching on the bandage at his temple. He brushed it off with a stiff shake of his head, muttering, "Nothing, just a scratch," but her gaze lingered, questioning, searching. "You've been different since yesterday," she said, and he felt irritation rise, not at her but at the truth in her words. He turned away, dropping his jacket onto the back of a chair, his voice clipped, "Just tired." It was a long night. He moved past her, eager to bury himself in the familiar routines that usually kept his mind occupied. The next day he returned to the office, the city's glass towers gleaming in the morning sun. Meetings filled his calendar from dawn until evening, contracts spread before him like battle plans, numbers climbing higher with every signature. His colleagues congratulated him on the previous deal, glasses of champagne raised in his honor, but each word of praise rang hollow. He found his eyes drifting often to the window, watching the flow of people below, none of them aware of him, none of them caring, and in that indifference, he felt something he couldn't shake. By the third day the restlessness had turned into a weight pressing on his chest. He sat in his corner office high above the streets, papers stacked neatly in front of him, yet the only thing he could see was the rain-soaked faces of two boys refusing the money he tried to press into their hands. At night he lay awake beside Clara, staring at the ceiling of their vast bedroom while she slept, his mind circling endlessly. He thought of the way the porridge had tasted, simple but warm, filling in a way the richest meals never did. He thought of Eli Boy's bright smile and Lucas One's calm steadiness, their refusal so natural, as though kindness was not a currency to be bargained with, but a duty carried without question. Compared to that, the pages of contracts and the cold weight of money in his wallet seemed meaningless, like sand slipping through his fingers. Finally, one evening as they sat across from each other at the long dining table, Clara set down her fork and asked softly, "What's wrong, David? You've been elsewhere all week." He hesitated, fighting the instinct to deflect, then sighed, rubbing at his temple. "I can't stop thinking about them," he admitted. "Two boys out there with nothing, helping me like it was the most natural thing in the world. They wouldn't take a cent, and here I am, closing deals, piling up money, but for what? None of it feels like it matters anymore." Clara's eyes softened, her voice steady but gentle. "Maybe it's because you finally saw what does matter. Maybe you needed that reminder." Her words lingered long after, echoing in the silence of the house, and by the time the third sleepless night had passed, David knew he couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The next morning, he dressed simply, not in a tailored suit but in casual clothes, and when Clara saw him at the door, she only asked, "Where are you going?" He gave her a faint smile, the first genuine one she had seen in days. "Back," he said quietly, "back to that village. Back to those boys. I need to see them again." And with that he stepped outside, keys in hand, heart heavier than it had ever been, but for the first time in years he felt like he was walking toward something that might truly matter. The next morning, David drove the familiar stretch of road, though this time there was no storm, no rush, only the quiet persistence of his own resolve pulling him back toward the place that had unsettled him so deeply. The fields were still damp from the week's rains, the grass bending under the weight of dew, and when he finally turned onto the dirt track that led to the small weathered house, he felt his chest tighten, as though the moment itself carried a gravity he had not known in years. The house stood as it had before, paint peeling, roof sagging, but there was a warmth in the air around it, a kind of life that his own mansion never carried. He knocked gently, and the door opened to reveal Lucas Boy, his eyes widening in surprise before a grin spread across his face. "Mister, you came back." Eli darted into view behind him, nearly bouncing with excitement, and their mother appeared soon after, her expression cautious but not unkind. She invited him in, and once more he found himself at their kitchen table, the smell of porridge and fried eggs filling the air, bowls already set out as if expecting one more. They ate together, the boys chattering about their day, their small voices filling the room with a brightness that made David feel both out of place and strangely at ease. When the meal was nearly done, he set down his spoon, folded his hands, and spoke carefully. "I want to do something for you. Not because you helped me, not because I owe you, but because it's right. You deserve more than this roof that leaks and these floors that break under your feet. Let me help." For a moment silence hung heavy. Margaret's lips pressed together, as she shook her head slowly, her voice steady but firm. "We don't need your pity, Mr. Whitmore. We've managed, we don't want charity." Her words struck him harder than he expected, yet he understood, because that was how it looked, a wealthy man tossing scraps to the poor, and that was not what he wanted to be. He left that morning, with little more than a polite nod, but inside he carried a determination that burned sharper than rejection. The following day he returned, this time not alone but with a small crew of workers and a truck stacked with tools and lumber. The boys stared wide-eyed as the men began unloading, their mother rushing out onto the porch, her voice raised in protest. "Mr. Whitmore, I told you, we don't want this." David stepped forward, his suit jacket left behind for plain clothes, sleeves rolled, determination etched into his face. "I know what you said, but this isn't about pity, this is about fixing what's broken. You helped me when you didn't have to. Now let me do the same." He didn't wait for permission. He lifted a hammer, joined the men at the roof, and began to work. The hours stretched under the sun, sweat soaking his shirt, his muscles straining in ways they hadn't in decades, but each nail driven, each board set in place, chipped away at the wall between him and the family watching. The boys soon joined in, eager to hand him tools, to climb ladders and fetch nails, their laughter turning the labor into something more than work. Even their mother, though reluctant, found herself carrying water, then preparing meals for the men, and by dusk the roof stood patched, the leaks sealed, the first sign that change was possible. Day after day, David returned. Floors were replaced, the kitchen walls shored up, the stove fixed until it no longer smoked. He sat at the table each evening, eating the same simple meals as the family, and for the first time in years the taste of food meant more than fuel, it meant belonging. He listened to the boys speak of their dreams, of cars they wanted to fix and lives they wanted to build, and he listened to their mother speak quietly of her illness, of the strain of making do with too little for too long. One afternoon, he drove her into the city himself, walking her into a clinic, and speaking with doctors until she had treatment lined up, expenses covered without question. The gratitude in her eyes was wordless, but it carved something deep inside him, something that felt like purpose. Weeks passed, and the house no longer looked the same. The roof was whole, the kitchen bright, the floors sturdy, but David did not stop there. He arranged for the boys to have apprenticeships not only at the shop they had walked to each day, but at a proper training center in town, covering their fees and buying them the tools they would need. He set up a small scholarship fund in their names, not only for them but for other children in the village, so that opportunity would not stop at their door. Soon neighbors began to take notice, drifting by to see the changes, to ask questions, and what began as one act of help rippled outward into something larger. Hope, once scarce in that small place, began to stir, and through it all David found himself changed. He no longer counted the hours in contracts signed or money earned, but in boards hammered, meals shared, conversations held under the quiet hum of evening. He discovered that labor, though it left his body sore, left his spirit lighter. He discovered that sitting with two boys at a rough wooden table filled him with more satisfaction than the finest banquet. And most of all, he discovered that helping without expectation gave him back something he had never known he had lost, a sense of being human, of being part of something greater than himself. By the time the last board was nailed into place, and the final brushstroke of paint dried, the small house no longer looked like the sagging structure David had first seen leaning against the storm. It stood proud now, roof whole, windows gleaming, porch sturdy beneath new planks, and though it would never rival the grandeur of his mansion, it radiated something his own home had never carried: life, warmth, belonging. As the workers packed up their tools, and the sun dipped low, casting long golden beams across the yard, David stood beside the family, his clothes dusty, his hands blistered, yet his chest lighter than it had felt in decades. Lucas boy, lingered near him, silent for a time before speaking in a voice almost too quiet for the others to hear. "Mister," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon, "when I grow up, I want to help people too, like you helped us." David turned slowly, struck by the sincerity in the boy's gaze, the way those simple words carried a weight beyond his years. His throat tightened, and when he answered his voice was thick with emotion he did not bother to hide. "Lucas," he said softly, "you already started the moment you stopped to help me on that road. Don't ever forget that." The boy's face lit with a mixture of pride and determination, and David felt something shift inside him again, as though a circle had closed, as though the future had just revealed a glimpse of itself. Not long after, neighbors began arriving, drawn by the noise of hammers and the sight of fresh paint, carrying baskets of bread, jars of preserves, plates of roasted vegetables. What began as a few curious visitors grew into a gathering, people spilling into the yard, their voices rising in laughter and conversation. Someone brought a guitar, another a jug of cider, and soon the evening became a celebration, not of charity, but of community. Children chased one another through the grass, while the adults crowded around the table that had been carried outside, laden now with both humble dishes and unexpected abundance. Clara, the boy's mother, moved through the crowd with a smile brighter than David had ever seen on her face, her eyes glistening when she looked at him as if to say without words, "You gave us back more than a house, you gave us hope." And David, for the first time in as long as he could remember, did not feel like an outsider. People clasped his hand, clapped his back, passed him food with an easy familiarity that needed no contract, no transaction. He was no longer the stranger in the expensive suit. He was simply David, sitting cross-legged in the grass with two boys at his side, eating bread and stew under the open sky, laughing with neighbors he had only just met. In their eyes he saw no calculation, no expectation, only acceptance, and it struck him with the force of a revelation. This was wealth, this was success, not the numbers inked onto contracts, but the connections that bound people together. When he finally left that night, driving slowly back toward the city, Clara by his side in the passenger seat, he felt no hollow ache, no restless hunger for the next deal. Instead there was a deep quiet peace settling over him, as steady and enduring as the road itself. Clara reached across the console, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and he glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile that was not practiced but real. "I think," he said softly, almost to himself, "I finally understand what matters." She squeezed his arm, her own smile tender, and for the first time in years they drove in silence that was not heavy but full, as though words were no longer needed. At dawn the car reached the stretch of country road, where it had all begun, the place where the storm had broken him down, and two boys had stopped to build him back up. The sky was clear now, painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the fields stretching endlessly under the new light. David slowed, lowering the window to breathe the cool morning air, and for a moment he simply sat there, watching the sun rise over the road that had once nearly ended him but instead had given him a beginning. The village behind him was alive with hope, the city ahead, waiting with its familiar demands, but here, in this still moment between, David understood at last, true wealth was not in fortune or power, but in kindness freely given, in connections that endured, in the quiet courage of two boys who had shown him what it meant to live. And with the dawn breaking bright before him, he drove on, certain that whatever lay ahead, he was no longer the man he had been. He was more. He was finally whole. Months slipped quietly into years, and the small village that had once seemed forgotten by time began to hum with new life. The house David had rebuilt stood not just as a home but as a kind of symbol, a reminder that kindness could ripple outward farther than anyone imagined. True to his word, he had not disappeared after the celebrations faded. He returned often, sometimes with Clara by his side, sometimes alone, each visit bringing something new, a shipment of books for the tiny school, supplies for the workshop, or simply his presence, unhurried and genuine. The villagers no longer looked at him with the wary eyes reserved for outsiders. He had become part of their rhythm, someone who listened, who remembered their names, who asked questions and waited for real answers. And through it all, two boys grew beneath his watchful gaze, their lives unfolding in ways that would forever be tied to that single act of stopping on a stormy road. Lucas, tall now, shoulders broad from work, carried within him the same quiet steadiness that had once guided his small hands as he fixed a stranger's tire. Eli, still younger by 4 years but endlessly curious, matched his brother's determination with a spark of ingenuity that caught David's attention every time they spoke. The two of them spent their days at the local vocational school David had sponsored, learning the intricacies of machinery, engines, and repair, but it was more than technical skill they absorbed. It was purpose, confidence, the belief that their lives could stretch beyond the boundaries of their small town. David visited often, sometimes sitting quietly in the back of the classroom as they worked, his eyes soft with pride. He never interfered, never flaunted what he had done, he only watched, offering guidance when they sought it, his satisfaction drawn not from gratitude but from witnessing growth. Years later, when Lucas turned 20 and Eli 16, the day came that marked a new beginning. They stood outside the sleek glass building of Whitmore Industries, dressed in crisp shirts and modest ties, their faces bright with both nerves and excitement. David greeted them in the lobby, his hair grayer now, his posture less rigid, but his presence still commanding. "Ready for your first day?" he asked, and Lucas grinned, glancing at his brother. "We've been ready, mister, just didn't think we'd ever end up here." David smiled at that, the kind that reached his eyes. "You earned this. This isn't a favor, it's your work, your heart that brought you here." Inside the company, they began as interns, learning the systems, shadowing engineers, absorbing everything they could. Some employees whispered, assuming the boys were charity cases, another of the boss's personal projects, but those whispers faded quickly as the brothers proved themselves. Lucas was deliberate, patient, with an instinct for leadership that reminded many of David in his younger years. Eli had a gift for design, for seeing problems from angles others missed, and his ideas soon began finding their way into real projects. They stayed late, asked questions, took notes, and slowly became part of the heartbeat of the place. David would often watch from his office window as they crossed the lobby at the end of the day, tired but smiling, and in those moments he felt the kind of pride that no stock report or board meeting had ever given him. One evening, long after most of the building had emptied, Lucas knocked softly on David's door. "Come in," David said, looking up from a folder, and the young man stepped inside, hesitating for a breath before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you," Lucas said quietly, "not for the job, for everything before that, for believing in us." David leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Lucas," he said, "you and your brother taught me more about belief than I ever taught you. I didn't lift you up, you showed me how to stand again." Lucas looked down, blinking fast, then nodded. "Eli says he wants to build something of his own one day, a place that teaches kids like us, who never had the chance." David's chest swelled with emotion, his voice soft. "Then I'll help him do it. Both of you. Whatever path you choose, I'll be here." Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass, reflections rippling like the surface of memory. Years ago, David had driven these same streets with his mind full of numbers and his heart empty. Now, every light seemed to hum with meaning. Every face he passed reminded him of the lives intertwined with his own. When he left the office that night, the air was cool and clean, the sky clear above him. He drove not toward the grand estate, but toward home, the smaller one he and Clara had moved into since, a place where laughter filled the kitchen and quiet moments carried more worth than all the noise of success. A month later, he returned once more to the village, not as a benefactor but as family. The air was sweet with the scent of cut grass and baked bread, the sound of children's laughter spilling down the lane. Lucas and Eli were there too, back for a visit, standing beside their mother in front of the same house that had once nearly crumbled. The paint was bright now, the garden alive with flowers, and when David stepped out of the car, they ran to greet him, just as they had years before when they were boys. "You kept your promise," Eli said, his grin wide and bright. David laughed softly, his voice catching, "So did you." As the sun dipped below the hills and the first stars began to prick the sky, David looked out at the village, the glow of lanterns, the distant hum of voices, the feeling of life continuing. It struck him then that this, all of it had grown from something so small, a moment of compassion on a stormy morning, and as the night deepened, he understood that the world could be rebuilt one quiet act at a time, one choice to stop and help when others might keep driving. When dawn came, he stood once more on that same stretch of road where it had all begun. The air was cool, the horizon glowing pink and gold, no storm now, no wrecked car, only calm and light. The road stretched ahead, smooth and endless, and David smiled to himself, the sound of the brothers' laughter still echoing faintly behind him. The world, he thought, was never changed by wealth or power alone, but by kindness passed from one hand to another, carried forward like morning light. And as the sun rose higher, washing the fields in warmth, David stepped forward, knowing that his journey and theirs was only just beginning. The years that followed tested Lucas and Eli in ways neither of them nor David could have predicted. At Whitmore Industries, where ambition was currency and failure had no shelter, the two brothers rose not through privilege but through persistence, building their path one challenge at a time. David, now more mentor than magnate, watched them closely, not with favoritism but with the measured scrutiny of a man who had learned that true potential reveals itself only under pressure. One autumn morning, he called them into his office, the skyline stretching wide behind him like a painted horizon. "It's time for something bigger," he said, sliding two folders across his desk. "A new project overseas, complex, demanding. I want you both to lead it." Their eyes widened, half disbelief, half determination, and for a moment neither spoke. Lucas finally cleared his throat. "You trust us with this?" David leaned back, his gaze steady. "You've earned it. Now prove to yourselves that I was right." The assignment took them far from home, to a manufacturing site in Singapore for Lucas and a joint venture in Germany for Eli, each with its own labyrinth of logistics, cultures and expectations. At first the work was overwhelming. Time zones blurred, negotiations stalled, and sleepless nights stretched into weeks. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the enormity of what they were trying to achieve threatened to crush them. But every time they faltered, David's voice echoed in their minds, quiet grounding, reminding them that excellence was built the same way they'd learned to fix that first flat tire, one turn of the wrench at a time, one problem solved, one step forward. Lucas learned the art of leadership, guiding teams twice his age through crises with calm precision, while Eli's designs began attracting attention across the company, his ideas fresh, efficient, alive with innovation. Bit by bit, the projects turned, momentum building until success no longer seemed improbable but inevitable. Months later, when they returned to headquarters, the entire company felt the impact of what they had accomplished. Reports sang their praises, contracts multiplied, and even the most skeptical executives began to nod with respect when their names were mentioned. David gathered them once again in his office, but this time the tone was different. "You've done more than I asked," he said, standing by the window, the afternoon sun catching the silver in his hair. "You didn't just finish the job, you led, you inspired. That's something I can't teach. That's something you earned." Lucas and Eli exchanged a glance, humility and pride mingling in their expressions, and before they could respond, David continued, "As of today, you're no longer trainees. Lucas, you'll oversee operations in our Southeast Asia division. Eli, you'll head product innovation in Europe. The company is yours to help shape." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the soft hum of the city below. Then Eli smiled, his voice trembling slightly. "We'll make you proud, mister." David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You already have." Their rise was swift but deserved. News spread through Whitmore Industries, two brothers from a small village now steering global projects, and yet for all their new status, neither lost the humility that had defined them from the start. Lucas handled leadership with quiet strength, treating every employee with respect. Eli's inventive energy transformed departments into creative hubs that people wanted to be part of. Together they became symbols within the company, not of charity fulfilled, but of potential realized, proof that opportunity, when given with faith, could grow into greatness. David watched them flourish, pride swelling not in ownership, but in the knowledge that his belief in them had been the truest investment he had ever made. Years later, when the dust of boardrooms and airports finally settled into something gentler, David and Clara drove once again down that long rural road, past the fields now green and full, to the house that had started it all. The home was almost unrecognizable, fresh paint, a new porch, a garden bursting with color, but the heart of it remained the same. Inside, laughter spilled from the kitchen, where Lucas, now married to a kind woman named Maya, was helping set the table. Eli was in the yard, chasing a giggling toddler, his nephew, under the evening sun. When David stepped through the doorway, the room seemed to brighten. "Mr. David," Eli called, rushing in to embrace him before Eli boy's laughter drew them all back to the table. Clara joined Maya and Lucas's mother at the stove, her hands busy but her smile content. Dinner that night was a tapestry of voices and stories, plates passing hand to hand, the air thick with warmth and the scent of home-cooked food. David sat at the head of the table, not as the man who once signed their paychecks, but as family, surrounded by the lives he had touched, and who had in turn transformed him. Lucas raised his glass midway through the meal, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "To second chances," he said softly, meeting David's eyes, "to kindness that never expected anything back." David nodded, his heart full. "And to you," he replied, "for proving that sometimes the smallest act can change everything." The room fell quiet for a moment, the only sound the gentle crackle of the fireplace, before laughter and conversation filled it once more, spilling out into the warm night. When the evening ended, David and Clara stepped onto the porch, the same porch he'd once helped repair, now glowing under soft lantern light. The sky above was clear, the stars sharp against the dark. In the distance, the road stretched out like a ribbon of silver, the same road where it had all begun so many years ago. Clara leaned into him, her voice a whisper. "You gave them a future," she said. David shook his head slowly, smiling as he watched Lucas and Eli laughing with their families inside. "No," he murmured, "they gave it to themselves. I just pointed the way." The wind rustled through the fields, carrying with it the faint hum of laughter and the promise of tomorrow. And as the last light of evening melted into the horizon, David felt it, the same quiet peace he had found once before, only deeper now, richer, complete. It was the kind of ending that didn't close a story, but opened another, one where kindness had become legacy, and every life it touched would carry it forward, like the first light of dawn over that once stormy road. Years had passed since that stormy morning, when a stranded millionaire met two boys on a muddy back road. The world had changed for them all. Lucas and Eli were no longer the scrappy teenagers with grease on their hands and hope in their eyes. They had become men of purpose, respected and trusted inside the glass towers where decisions shaped lives. David often watched them from across the boardroom, seeing not employees but reflections of something far greater: integrity, resilience, the kind of strength that money could never buy. Together they built projects that reached across borders, the kind of work that mattered not just for profit but for people. David no longer cared about headlines or net worth, he cared about impact, about the legacy of goodness he was leaving behind. Their success grew, each milestone another step away from that dusty village road, yet somehow it was also a step closer to its spirit. When they secured a landmark international contract, one that would bring jobs and education to underprivileged communities abroad, the entire office erupted in applause. That night, the company hosted a celebration atop a high-rise terrace under the glittering skyline, where champagne flowed, laughter echoed, and pride filled the air like light. David stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. "To Lucas and Eli," he said, his voice carrying warmth and gravity, "to the ones who remind us that doing good and doing well can be the same thing." The room cheered, and for a brief, perfect moment, everything felt right. But life, as it always does, had its own plans. Just as the laughter began to settle into the hum of music, Lucas's phone vibrated on the table. He answered without thought, smiling as he excused himself, then froze, his expression draining of color. The chatter around him dulled into static as the words on the other end struck him like a blow. A nurse's voice, trembling yet calm. "Your mother, sir, Margaret. She collapsed in the street. She's at County General. Please come quickly." The next few minutes blurred. Lucas's chair scraped back, his glass toppled and shattered, and Eli's voice cut through the confusion, asking what was wrong. But Lucas couldn't speak, he could barely breathe. "It's Mom," he finally managed, his voice breaking. "She's in the hospital." Within moments, the two brothers were gone, rushing through the rain-slick streets, their suits still smelling of celebration and smoke. In the car, Eli's hands shook as he tried to call the hospital again, tears spilling freely down his cheeks. Lucas gripped the wheel tight, eyes fixed on the road ahead, whispering over and over, she'll be fine," as if saying it could make it true. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. The white light of the emergency ward burned harsh and indifferent, as the doctor met them with that look, the one that says everything without words. "We did all we could," he said softly. "She's gone." For a heartbeat the world stopped. The floor seemed to tilt beneath them, air leaving their lungs in a single, shattering instant. Then came the sound, raw, unfiltered grief, echoing down the sterile hallway, as Lucas sank to his knees and Eli clung to him, both of them trembling like children again. The funeral was held 3 days later, under a gray winter sky that hung heavy with unfallen rain. Neighbors from their village came, people who remembered Margaret as the woman who always gave even when she had little to spare. David and Clara stood with the brothers near the grave, their presence silent but steady, a kind of comfort words could never carry. When the service ended, David placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "She was proud of you," he said quietly. "Everything you've done, everything you've become, it's because of her. Don't ever forget that." But grief lingers long after condolences fade. The following weeks blurred into sleepless nights and empty days. The brothers returned to work, but their hearts weren't there. Their desks remained cluttered with papers they didn't touch, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Meetings passed in silence, decisions delayed, motivation slipping like sand through their fingers. David saw it all, the quiet unraveling, the heaviness of loss, and one evening he called them both to his home. Clara prepared a simple dinner, warm and familiar. When they arrived, they looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of their sorrow had folded them inward. They ate quietly at first, the sound of the crackling fire filling the space between them. Finally David spoke, his tone low and steady. "You know," he said, "when I lost myself years ago, it wasn't success that saved me, it was kindness. Your mother's kind of kindness, steady, patient, never asking for anything in return. You both carry that in you. She didn't raise you to stop here, she raised you to keep building." His voice softened, his gaze firm. "She's gone, yes, but she's not lost. Not as long as you keep living the way she taught you." For a long while, the brothers said nothing. Then Lucas nodded slowly, his jaw set, while Eli wiped his eyes, whispering, "We'll make her proud." David smiled faintly. "You already have," he said. From that night on, they began to heal, not all at once, grief never allows that, but slowly, steadily, through purpose. They returned to their work with renewed focus, pouring their pain into progress. The projects they led after that carried her name quietly in their foundations, in scholarships for single mothers, in community centers built in forgotten towns, and as months passed, something like peace began to grow between the cracks of loss, fragile but real. A year later, winter came again, bringing with it the glow of Christmas lights and the hush of falling snow. David's home was filled with warmth once more, the scent of roast chicken, the laughter of children, the hum of familiar voices. Lucas arrived with his wife, Maya, their young daughter asleep in her arms, her small head tucked against Lucas's shoulder. Eli followed, now engaged to a kind woman named Sophie, whose laughter seemed to fill every corner of the room. Clara greeted them all with hugs, and David, older, grayer but peaceful, stood watching as the family gathered around his table. Dinner was simple, yet it felt sacred. They talked about everything and nothing, work, travel, the weather, and when the conversation turned to memories, it was Lucas who spoke first. "You know," he said, looking at David, "there isn't a day I don't think about how all of this began. A flat tire, a storm, 2 kids with a wrench." His voice wavered slightly, but his smile held. "If that day hadn't happened, I don't think any of us would be here." David chuckled softly. "I don't believe in coincidences anymore," he said, "just crossroads, and the people who show up when you need them most." Maya leaned her head on Lucas's shoulder, her voice gentle. "He told me that story when we met," she said. "At first I thought it sounded too good to be true, but now seeing all of this, I think it's better than a story. It's life, real messy beautiful life." The firelight flickered across their faces, and for a while they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes with deep familiarity. The children played at their feet, laughter rising like music, and outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the world in quiet grace. As the night drew to a close, Lucas lifted his glass. "To the road that started it all," he said, smiling. "And to the man who taught us that wealth isn't counted in numbers, but in lives touched." The glasses clinked softly, their sound mingling with the crackle of the fire. David met his gaze and smiled back. "And to the ones who reminded me what it means to live." When they finally stepped outside, the snow glistened beneath the pale moonlight, the air crisp and alive. David and Clara stood at the doorway, watching as Lucas, Maya, Eli and the others made their way down the drive, their laughter fading gently into the night. For a long moment, David stayed there, staring at the road stretching beyond his home, the same kind of road where it had all begun, once wet with rain, now shining white beneath the stars. He took Clara's hand, her fingers warm in his, and together they looked toward the horizon, where the first blush of dawn was already spreading across the snow. It was quiet, almost sacred. The world felt right, and as the light rose higher, touching the frozen trees and fields beyond, David realized that this was the truest miracle of all, that from one small act of kindness, an entire lifetime of love had unfolded. The storm had passed long ago, but its memory still whispered through the morning air, gentle and eternal. The road that had once been dark and lonely now shone bright beneath the sunrise, stretching endlessly forward, full of promise, full of grace, leading toward everything good that was yet to come.